Too Many Losing Heroines surprised everyone this year with its stellar adaptation of an otherwise run-of-the-mill rom-com light novel. Between its fantastic character animation, catchy opening, and extreme dedication to setting details, Too Many Losing Heroines quickly won me over. Even if the show, at first glance, looks like a generic harem romance show with the lethargic protagonist, it looks like one of the best anime to air this year, and that's enough for me to sing its praises. No, really, it surprises me just how much every shot looks so grounded and immersive. The world of Too Many Losing Heroines feels distinctly lived in, meaning that this is a world that feels remarkably believable. Each unique setting is full of specific details. The colors reflect the changing seasons, while the lighting realistically pours into rooms according to the geometry of the space. And one of the main benefits from putting all this effort into your anime is that it begins to feel 3D. In photography and live action filming, we often talk about how we translate something 3D into a 2D presentation. As a result, there are numerous factors that must be accounted for, like camera angles and subject sizes, in order to effectively communicate the 3D aspects lost in filming. Anime, in many ways, aims to do the same but must create 3D where there is only 2D originally. After all, anime is still predominantly a series of drawings with layers of effects and the occasional CGI. You can leave your anime as 2D, but the flatness of the visuals will turn most away, and ultimately break your immersion. So how do you create engaging 3D elements out of nothing? Too Many Losing Heroines is a textbook case of the myriad of techniques anime studios apply to imbue their shows with the sense of three-dimensionality. And many of these techniques are, again, the same things photographers and live-action directors consider in their respective arts. One of these specific tricks is directly related to cameras, the focus. How sharply your subject appears in the frame depends on the settings of the camera, so parts of the frame that are not as sharp or blurred are out of this focus zone due to their distance from the camera. Too Many Losing Heroines seeks to actively draw attention to the focus of its camera by layering several things in a single composition. In nearly every scene, you'll often see some slightly blurred objects in the foreground. Stacking these layers and blurring them creates the illusion that there are many objects at various distances from the camera and thus depth. In some scenes, characters walk in and out of the focus zone. There are even shots that pull focus, shifting the sharpness from one subject to another along the Z-axis, mimicking live-action techniques. Even without the focusing, layering subjects in shots is essential for establishing depth. In episode 1, during Nukumizu and Anna's first conversation, layers are skillfully used to turn a relatively mundane conversation into an energetic encounter. The camera is consistently placed behind characters' heads, keeping the other character in view but out of focus. Layers are overlapped to help define who is in the background and the foreground. Even characters in the layers farthest away are actively moving about, showing that the world around the characters is also actively and always moving forward, as opposed to these extras being static or stuck in looping idle animations that blend into the background. This effect is further enhanced by parallax, where subjects shift position depending on their distance from the camera as it moves, creating the illusion of 3D space. Simply put, objects closer to the camera appear to move faster than those farther away, again adding depth to the scene. The courage to avoid square-on shots of the characters in favor of camera angles and layouts that show off more perspectives develops the viewer's spatial understanding. Alongside these different camera angles comes the need to nail these size relationships. Anna, when in the foreground, has to be just big enough, and Nukumizu, in the background, just small enough to sell their positioning relative to the camera. And of course, these layer positions are not only for selling the space, it's for narrative dynamics. Many shots put Anna, size larger, in the foreground to emphasize how overwhelming her rant is to a clueless Nukumizu, who is less listening and more tolerating her antics. It goes to show that while it is certainly more effort to draw characters in the right proportions and from the right angles, the benefits both visually and narratively gained are well worth their salt. Another way to depict the depth of a scene is by showing how light interacts with it. Light works similarly to focus in this case. Just as the sharpness of an object depends on its distance from the camera, the brightness or type of lighting depends on its position relative to the light source. The composition is emphasizing the physical space between objects. Too many shows are lazy and stick with the universal or high-key lighting for every setting and time, but that approach wastes a lot of potential information that can be transmitted to the audience. The lighting can clarify which way characters are looking. It is clear that these two characters are facing one another during this conversation because the fire illuminates opposite sides of their faces. This detail grounds the shot-reverse shot technique utilized to portray this conversation. Additionally, illuminating only part of their faces highlights their contours, accentuating the three-dimensionality of the character designs. On this staircase, characters closer to the camera and thus closer to the railings where the sun is bearing down upon appear brighter compared to the ones in the shadows or inside the building. Lighting elucidates positioning and allows animators to create three-dimensional space by controlling the luminance of the colors. And ultimately, by allowing different lightings in different positions, you open up the potential for lighting to define character dynamics. In this conversation between Nukumizu and Lemon, the two are situated on the same couch, but Nukumizu's proximity to the window puts him in the light while Lemon is in the dark. Their exchange of half-truths is mirrored by this contrast, symbolizing the emotional distance between them. In the next episode, the two are now equally illuminated by the moonlight during a more open conversation. When Yumeko interrupts the literature club to deliver some bad news, split lighting is used to cast a shadow over the upper half of Yumeko's body. This creates a dramatic atmosphere by hinting towards something hidden from the cast or viewer. This overall technique, known in painting as chiaroscuro, is all about controlling which parts of your composition are covered in light versus shadows to direct attention and support the story. I could go on about what else lighting offers, but there's already a video for that. The last element I'd like to touch upon is the use of shapes and lines. I mentioned earlier that Too Many Losing Heroines often eschews the square-on shots in favor of ones that film from a slightly off angle. When you change the camera angle like this, you end up with much more interesting lines. In particular, you trade away these rigid horizontal and vertical lines in favor of ones that are at an angle. Angle lines form from, you guessed it, the distance from your camera. And these lines can be found in essentially any object or subject in the frame. These bookshelves in reality are flat, horizontal lines of wood, but at this angle, some parts of that line are farther away, making them appear smaller or truncated. These lines intuitively create a sense of greater energy and movement. Part of that comes from the way the lines naturally guide your eyes along them. Take this scene of Anna and Nukumizu squaring off in the club room. The chair in the foreground and the gradient of light from the windows helps establish a three-dimensionality, but note all the visible and invisible diagonal lines in the composition. If you follow them from their endpoints, starting from those nearest to the camera to the ones farthest away, you'll see how they guide your eye to Nukumizu and Anna on the right. These types of lines are called leading lines because the vanishing point can be placed behind the subject and thus draw the viewer's attention as they follow those lines. They can also be called converging lines because of the way the lines, if traced to their endpoints, will eventually hit a vanishing point where they all intersect. So littering your composition with lines from the structures of your buildings or the placement of props endows even the most basic of blocking with three-dimensionality. If this all sounds familiar in some ways, that's because there's plenty of overlap with two of my other videos on blocking and lighting. It's difficult to separate some of these techniques from one another, but hopefully you can glean how uniquely strong Too Many Losing Heroines is at using those elements to pull you into its world. Convincing the audience that the world is three-dimensional is paramount to maintaining their interest. And I don't just mean visually. In many ways, finding opportunities to enable your composition to portray three-dimensionality unlocks many storytelling elements that can heighten the delivery of story beats to the audience. And now, returning to the question I asked earlier in the video, how do you make your 2D show 3D? By employing techniques that mimic real-world cinematography, you can turn your otherwise bland imagery into living worlds with depth and dimension.